What happens when a legendary music icon sits down for what should be a routine interview, only to discover the host has a hidden agenda that will ignite one of television's most explosive confrontations? It only took 23 seconds of disrespectful questioning for Chaka Khan to unleash a verbal storm that would leave Andy Cohen speechless and scrambling to save face on his own show. The studio lights were hot that Tuesday evening as Chaka Khan settled into the plush red chair across from Andy Cohen. The Queen of Funk had agreed to appear on Watch What Happens Live, expecting the usual promotional chat about her upcoming tour and latest projects. She wore a stunning black sequin jacket that caught the studio lights perfectly, her signature curls framing her face with regal elegance. Andy Cohen sat behind his desk, shuffling his index cards with what appeared to be nervous energy. His trademark smirk was already forming as he prepared to dive into questions that would soon reveal his true intentions for this interview. Welcome back to Watch What Happens Live. I'm Andy Cohen, and tonight we have the incomparable Chaka Khan with us. Andy announced to the cameras, his voice carrying that familiar late-night talk show cadence. Chaka, thanks for being here with us tonight. Thank you for having me, Andy. Chaka responded warmly, settling back into her chair with the confidence of someone who had done thousands of interviews over her decades-long career. Andy wasted no time getting to his real agenda. So, Chaka, I have to ask about something that's been buzzing around social media lately. There are some people saying your recent performances haven't quite hit the same notes they used to. What's your response to critics who say you're past your prime? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Chaka's expression shifted immediately from warm and welcoming to something much sharper. Her eyes narrowed as she processed what had just been asked. "Excuse me?" Chaka said slowly, her voice dropping to a dangerous tone that anyone familiar with her interviews would recognize as a warning sign. Andy, either oblivious to the shift in energy or deliberately pushing forward, continued his attack. "Well, you're 70 years old now, and some fans are wondering if maybe it's time to consider stepping back from live performances. The vocal demands of your classic hits might be too much for someone at this stage of their career." The studio audience, which had been buzzing with excitement moments before, fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the crew members behind the cameras seemed to sense that something had gone very wrong very quickly. Chaka Khan sat forward in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as she stared directly at Andy Cohen. "Let me get this straight. You invited me on your show to tell me I'm too old to sing?" No, that's not what I'm saying," Andy backpedaled, but his tone suggested he was enjoying the confrontation he had created. "I'm just asking about the natural evolution of a performer's career. It's a valid question that many artists face." "Valid question?" Chaka's voice rose slightly, and there was a musical quality to her anger that somehow made it even more intimidating. "Andy, I've been performing since before you were even born. I've sold over 70 million records worldwide. I have 10 Grammy Awards sitting on my shelf at home, and you want to sit there and question whether I can still perform?" The tension in the studio was now palpable. Camera operators were adjusting their angles to capture every moment of what was clearly becoming a career-defining moment for both the host and his guest. Andy tried to maintain his composure, but there was a slight tremor in his voice as he responded. "Chaka, I think you're misunderstanding my question. I'm simply trying to have an honest conversation about the challenges facing veteran performers in today's music industry." "Honest conversation?" Chaka laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Andy, there's nothing honest about what you're doing right now. You lured me here under false pretenses, pretending this was going to be a respectful interview about my career and my music. Instead, you're sitting there trying to make me defend my right to exist as an artist." The camera caught Andy's face as he realized his carefully planned ambush was backfiring spectacularly. His usual confidence was cracking, and beads of sweat were beginning to form on his forehead under the hot studio lights. "I never said anything about your right to exist as an artist," Andy protested weakly. "I'm just asking questions that I think my audience wants to hear answered." Chaka Khan stood up from her chair, her full presence now commanding the entire studio. "Your audience? Andy, your audience came here to see Chaka Khan, not to watch you try to tear me down on live television. They came here because they respect my legacy and my contributions to music." The studio audience began to murmur among themselves, and it was clear that their sympathies were entirely with Chaka Khan. Several audience members could be heard saying, "That's right," and "Tell him Chaka," in support of the legendary singer. Andy was now visibly sweating, his carefully crafted television persona crumbling before the cameras. "Chaka, please sit down. Let's talk about this like adults." "Adults?" Chaka's voice carried the full power of her decades of vocal training. "Andy, Adults don't invite respected artists onto their shows just to humiliate them. Adults don't use their platform to try to diminish someone's life's work for cheap entertainment. The confrontation was escalating beyond anything anyone in the studio had expected. What had started as Andy's attempt to create a viral moment was turning into his own public embarrassment. "Look, if I offended you, that wasn't my intention," Andy said, his voice now noticeably shaking. "Maybe we can start over and talk about your upcoming tour instead." Chaka Khan looked at him with a mixture of disgust and pity. "Start over? Andy, you can't unsay what you just said. You can't take back the disrespect you just showed me and every veteran performer who's ever graced a stage." The studio lights seemed to burn even hotter as Chaka Khan remained standing, her presence filling every corner of the room. Andy Cohen sat frozen behind his desk, his index cards now forgotten as he stared up at the music legend who was clearly not finished with him. "You know what the real problem is here, Andy?" Chaka continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience in an industry that had tried to silence strong women countless times before. "You thought you could bring me on here and treat me like some washed-up has-been that you could push around for your little show." Andy attempted to regain control of his own program. "Chaka, I think we're having a miscommunication here. Why don't you sit back down and we can discuss this calmly?" "Miscommunication?" Chaka's laugh was sharp and cutting. "There's no miscommunication, Andy. You knew exactly what you were doing when you planned these questions. You thought you could ambush me, catch me off guard, maybe get me to break down or get defensive about my age and my voice." The audience was now fully engaged, hanging on every word of this unexpected confrontation. Several people in the front row were shaking their heads in disapproval at Andy's behavior, while others were recording the moment on their phones, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Andy's voice cracked slightly as he tried once more to salvage the situation. "I'm sorry if my questions came across the wrong way. That really wasn't my intention at all." "Your intention?" Chaka stepped closer to his desk, and Andy instinctively leaned back in his chair. "Andy, let me tell you what your intention was. Your intention was to create some kind of dramatic moment that would get people talking about your show. You wanted to see if you could rattle the great Chaka Khan." The crew members were now exchanging worried glances, unsure whether they should continue filming or cut to commercial. The show's producers were frantically whispering among themselves, realizing that their host had walked into a disaster entirely of his own making. "Well, congratulations," Chaka continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You got your dramatic moment, but it's not going to play out the way you thought it would." Andy was now visibly perspiring, his carefully styled hair beginning to show the effects of the studio heat and his obvious stress. "Chaka, please, let's just take a breath here and try to have a productive conversation." "Productive?" Chaka's eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Andy, there's nothing productive about what you've done here tonight. You've wasted my time. You've disrespected your audience. And you've shown everyone exactly what kind of person you really are when the cameras are rolling." The silence in the studio was deafening, except for the low hum of the cameras and the barely audible whispers from the audience. Andy looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would throw him a lifeline. But his crew and producers were all staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright embarrassment. "I've been in this business for over 5 decades, Chaka said, her voice now taking on a teaching tone, as if she were explaining something to a child who should know better. "I've dealt with reporters, interviewers, and talk show hosts who were trying to make their careers by tearing down established artists. But usually, they have the decency to be subtle about it." Andy opened his mouth to speak, but Chaka held up her hand to stop him. "No, Andy, you don't get to talk right now. You've said quite enough already," she declared with the authority of someone who had commanded stages around the world. "What you did here tonight wasn't journalism. It wasn't entertainment. It was just plain cruel." The camera operator zoomed in on Andy's face, capturing every beat of sweat, every nervous twitch, every moment of his growing realization that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "You want to know about my voice, Andy?" Chaka asked rhetorically. "My voice has carried me through 5 decades of hits. My voice has comforted people through heartbreak, made them dance at their weddings, and inspired countless other artists to find their own sound." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the stunned studio. "And tonight, my voice is telling you exactly what I think of your pathetic attempt to diminish my legacy for your cheap entertainment." Andy finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Chaka, I never meant to question your legacy." "But you did question it, Andy. The moment you suggested I was too old to perform, the moment you implied that my recent shows weren't up to standard, You questioned everything I've built over my entire career." The audience began to applaud, a slow clap that built into sustained appreciation for Chaka Khan's refusal to be disrespected. Andy looked out at his own audience turning against him, his face reddening with embarrassment. "Let me tell you something about age and experience, Andy," Chaka continued over the applause. "Every line on my face represents a song I've sung, a stage I've commanded, a crowd I've moved to tears or to their feet. My voice isn't weaker because I'm 70. It's richer, deeper, and more powerful because of everything it's been through." Andy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usual cockiness completely evaporated. "I understand what you're saying." "No, you don't understand, Andy. If you understood, you never would have asked those questions in the first place." The tension in the room was reaching a breaking point. Everyone could sense that something major was about to happen, though no one could predict exactly what form it would take. "You know what the saddest part of all this is?" Chaka asked, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its edge. "I actually used to respect your show. I thought you were different from some of the other late-night hosts. I thought you had more class than this." Andy's shoulders slumped as the full weight of his mistake became clear to him. "But I was wrong about you, wasn't I, Andy?" Chaka Khan's voice cut through the studio silence like a blade. "You're just like all the others who think they can use established artists as stepping stones for their own careers." Andy Cohen looked like a man drowning in his own show. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, taking a sip that did nothing to calm his obvious panic. "Chaka, I think we should probably take a commercial break and regroup." "Oh no, Andy," Chaka said firmly, placing both hands on his desk and leaning forward. "You don't get to hide behind a commercial break. You started this conversation on live television, and we're going to finish it on live television." The studio audience erupted in approval, with several people standing and cheering for Chaka Khan's refusal to let Andy escape the consequences of his actions. The applause seemed to give Chaka even more energy and determination. "You want to talk about what's happening in real time, Andy? Let's talk about what's happening right now," Chaka declared, her voice rising to fill every corner of the studio. "Right now, you're learning what it feels like when someone with real power and real talent refuses to be pushed around by a bully." Andy's face had gone from red to pale, and his usual television confidence had completely abandoned him. "I'm not trying to be a bully, Chaka. I was just asking questions." "Questions?" Chaka laughed, and this time there was genuine amusement in it, though it was the kind of laughter that made Andy look even smaller. "Andy, let me ask you a question. How would you feel if I invited you onto my show and spent the first 5 minutes questioning whether you were too old and too irrelevant to be hosting a talk show?" The hypothetical question hung in the air like a challenge, and Andy visibly flinched at the reversal of roles. Several audience members could be heard saying, "Exactly," and "How would you like it?" in support of Chaka's point. "That would be different," Andy mumbled weakly. "Different? How?" Chaka pressed, her voice sharp with incredulity. "Because you're younger? Because you're a man? Because you think somehow your career is more valuable than mine?" Andy opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water, unable to form a coherent response to Chaka's devastating logic. "I've been making music since 1970, Chaka continued, her voice taking on the rhythm and power of a preacher delivering a sermon. "I was singing hit songs when you were still in elementary school. I've influenced generations of artists who are now influencing the artists you probably think are relevant." The crew members behind the cameras were now openly staring at the unfolding disaster, some shaking their heads in disbelief at their host's spectacular failure. "And you thought," Chaka continued, building to what everyone could sense was going to be a climactic moment, "that you could sit there behind your little desk and question my ability to do what I've been doing longer than you've been alive?" Andy made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Chaka, I think maybe we should agree to disagree and move on to talking about your upcoming projects." "Move on?" Chaka's voice rose to a level that demonstrated exactly how powerful her 70-year-old voice really was. "Andy, the only person moving on here is me. I'm moving on from this interview, from this show, and from any future association with someone who has such little respect for the artists who built the industry you're trying to profit from." The realization of what was happening hit Andy like a physical blow. His most high-profile guest was about to walk off his show, and it was entirely his fault. "Wait, Chaka, please don't leave," Andy pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can start over. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about." "Start over?" Chaka began removing her microphone with deliberate, ceremonious movements. "Andy, some things can't be started over. Some mistakes can't be undone. And some people reveal who they really are in moments like this." She stood up from her chair for the final time, her full dignity and presence commanding every eye in the studio. You revealed who you really are tonight, Andy, and now I'm revealing who I am by refusing to sit here and pretend that what you did was acceptable. Andy was now visibly shaking, sweat pouring down his face as he watched his show collapse around him. Chaka, please, think about what you're doing. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, Chaka replied with absolute certainty. I'm showing your audience and everyone watching at home that Chaka Khan doesn't have to sit still for disrespect from anyone, including a talk show host who thinks he's bigger than he actually island. The audience began to rise to their feet, giving Chaka Khan a standing ovation as she prepared to leave. The applause was thunderous, drowning out any attempt Andy might have made to salvage the situation. This is what real power looks like, Andy, Chaka said over the applause, her voice carrying clearly despite the noise. Real power is knowing when to walk away from people who don't deserve your time, your talent, or your presence. Andy sat frozen behind his desk, watching helplessly as the Queen of Funk gathered her purse and began walking toward the studio exit. His producers were frantically signaling to him, but he seemed unable to process their instructions or take any action to save his show. Ladies and gentlemen, Chaka Khan announced to the audience and cameras as she reached the edge of the stage, "Thank you for your support tonight. This is how you handle someone who tries to tear you down. You stand up, you speak your truth, and you walk away with your dignity intact." With that final declaration, Chaka Khan walked off the set of Watch What Happens Live, leaving Andy Cohen sitting alone behind his desk in front of a cheering audience and rolling cameras, the full scope of his humiliation broadcast live to viewers around the world. The studio fell into chaos as producers rushed onto the set, audience members continued cheering and taking pictures, and Andy Cohen sat motionless, staring at the empty chair where one of music's greatest legends had just delivered the most devastating performance of his career.